We're here with Erik Molvar, Executive Director of Western Watersheds Project. How you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well, thank you.
Excellent. So we're going to talk for just a minute about the sage grouse, which many say and much data reflects is pretty much the largest, costliest, most expansive endangered species battle in the history of the country, if not the world. Back in 2015, Department of Interior, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service made a monumental decision on that, not to list the species under the Endangered Species Act. What's happened since then, Erik?
Well, since that time, those plans have been in effect. Of course, the Trump administration took office in 2017 and immediately started a plan to dismantle what limited protections the sage grouse were going to get under those 2015 plans. And they also abandoned efforts to come back 5 years later in 2020 and do a status review and see whether the bird should be listed based on what had happened in the interim. And of course, in the intervening years, the sage grouse populations have tanked even further and gone to new record lows. And so it's pretty obvious that the new plans that were adopted in 2015 have not recovered the bird and brought their numbers back up. But instead, this is a bird that continues to decline in the face of inadequate protections. And what we're going to see is we're going to see these populations state by state start going extinct if we don't have some real conservation measurable standards that are get applied.
And where you're from, the state of Wyoming, which is kind of ground zero for the sage grouse, at least it used to be, they even went as far as trying to implement a captive breeding and release program. Are they still doing that?
I think that the captive breeding and translocation program has been pretty well abandoned because they tried to go out and raid the nests of sage grouse to get eggs that they could incubate and take into captivity, and they couldn't find any grouse. That's how scarce these birds became. So that farming of sage grouse plan has pretty much fallen flat on its face, just as everybody predicted.
The numbers continue to decline. And, you know, even after they make a decision, it seems like the battle with the sage grouse is simply never ending. Will it ever be resolved, or is it just going to be an endless fight over this habitat and over the status of the bird?
Well, it's pretty obvious that some of the biggest and most powerful industrial lobbying groups, from the mining industry to the livestock industry to the oil and gas industry, all have a big stake on preventing sage grouse conservation from happening, because they want to use the sage grouse habitats, which stretch over tens of millions of acres of public land in the West. They want those acres to go into their profit margins and be able to use those to extract resources from public lands so that they can pad their bottom line and have quarterly profit earnings that look favorable to their investors. And so it's been tooth and nail that they've been fighting ever since the sage grouse conservation measures have been proposed, and we don't expect them to stop anytime soon. At the same time, conservationists understand that if you can protect the sage grouse, you can protect over 300 other species of plants and animals that depend on those exact same sagebrush habitats. And so this is an umbrella species that if you can protect the sage grouse, you can protect an entire ecosystem, and you can save the West and those wide open spaces and those recreational opportunities that Americans have come to love so much.
So is that what they mean when they say linchpin or keystone species?
Right. I mean, basically, if you are a species that protecting that species protects everything else, you're called an umbrella species. And so you are, if you're the sage grouse, you're creating an umbrella under which all the other species can be protected if you can keep the rain off the sage grouse, so to speak.
So speaking of how the battle rages on with the sage grouse, there's a battle you guys are getting into right now with another rider. What is that rider? What does it aim to do? What's the story there?
Well, in 2014, under the Obama administration, Congress put in a rider into the nationwide budget spending bill called the CR Omnibus. And that rider basically said the Fish and Wildlife Service was forbidden from spending 1 penny on listing the greater sage grouse under the Endangered Species Act. So it basically blocked the listing. That rider has been put back into the spending bill by Republicans year after year after year. Over the last couple of years, the House of Representatives, which is now in Democratic control, has been stripping that rider out, but then the Senate adds it back in because the Senate is still in Republican hands. And so we still have that rider that prevents the sage grouse from being listed under the Endangered Species Act. And the fact that rider is there, and the fact that you can't list the sage grouse with it there, is why the Trump administration has been able to undertake a plan of its own to gut the sage grouse protections, because there would be no consequence in doing that. Whereas if there was a threat of listing, then you wouldn't dare lift the protections that are in these plans on these BLM and Forest Service lands, for fear that the bird might get listed and have more draconian protections that come into play at that point.
And when we wind up in that situation with these riders, these specialized riders being snuck in there, isn't that oftentimes because they've failed with actual legislation? They can't even get it out of committee, so they kind of default onto trying to slip it in with a rider. Does that happen?
Well, certainly it's a time-honored trick to, if you can't get a bill to pass on its own merits through the Congress, to try and stick it on some kind of piece of must-pass legislation that involves big federal funding that everybody has to vote for. Now, the beauty of the Endangered Species Act is that it was supposed to get the politics out of endangered species decisions by making every decision made by the Fish and Wildlife Service based solely on the best available science.
That's been rolled back by the Trump administration, though, correct?
Well, they are trying to put in new endangered species regulations to gut that, and that's moving its way through the court system, and my guess is it's not going to survive.
What else do you want to tell us on the sage grouse today? What's the forecast?
The Trump administration has been doing everything it can to deregulate sage grouse protections. Groups like Western Watersheds Project have been doing everything we can to sue them every time they cross the line and fail to implement the protections that were guaranteed, because once those sage grouse plans were put into effect, under federal law, the BLM and the Forest Service are required by law to apply those protections. So the Trump administration has been trying to gut those protections. Those efforts have been illegal. We've been dragging them into court. We've been kicking their butt in court, and we've been stripping their ability to gut those regulations so far. And who knows, maybe the Biden administration will decide that it's time to have science-based conservation plans, which no previous administration has ever adopted in the past.
Well, there was no shortage of lawsuits going under the Obama administration, was there?
That's right. Western Watersheds Project sued to challenge the 2015 sage grouse plans that were put in under Obama because they failed to apply science-based protections that everybody knew, based on the science, is what the grouse needed. And so we put a lawsuit in place, and when the Trump administration went ahead and tried to gut those protections, we were in the catbird seat, and we were able to amend that lawsuit, and that's what got the injunction that blocked the Trump plans.
Erik Molvar, Executive Director of Western Watersheds Project, thanks for taking the time to be on the show with us today.
It's always a pleasure.